1. It was the final semester of my college years, and our drama department had been preparing for the big end-of-year showcase. The Auditorium, an old building on the outskirts of campus, was a place steeped in history. It was large, with high ceilings, rows of creaky seats, and a stage that had seen countless performances over the decades. But there was something about the place that always felt off. I, along with my fellow drama students, had spent countless hours rehearsing our lines and perfecting our performances. As the night of the showcase arrived, the auditorium was packed with students, faculty, and family members. Everyone was buzzing with excitement, ready for the performances to begin. As I waited backstage, nerves gnawing at my insides, I noticed something strange. The audience, which had been filled with chatter and laughter just moments before, had fallen eerily silent. I thought it was just nerves, or maybe the sheer focus of the crowd as they waited for the show to start. But the silence felt too heavy, too unnatural. My scene was up first. The stage lights flickered before coming to life, casting a warm glow across the stage. As I stepped out into the spotlight, I could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes on me. But when I looked into the audience, I froze. The entire audience was staring at me, motionless. Not a single person moved. It wasn't that they were engrossed in the performance, they were frozen, their faces blank and expressionless, like mannequins. Their eyes were wide open, but there was no emotion, no life behind them. The silence in the room grew deafening. I paused, unsure of what to do. The lights flickered again, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A figure standing at the back of the auditorium, just beyond the last row of seats. It was tall, dressed in a dark, flowing cloak, its face obscured by shadows. I could feel its presence, cold and oppressive. I tried to push through my performance, but the longer I stood there, the more I felt trapped in the room, surrounded by those lifeless eyes. I could hear my own breathing growing louder in the silence, and my heart pounded in my chest. Then, something even more unsettling happened. The figure at the back of the auditorium began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it walked toward the stage. My body froze in terror. The audience didn't react. They didn't blink or shift in their seats. They just continued to stare, as if they were part of some twisted dream. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran off the stage, leaving my fellow performers bewildered. Backstage, I was shaking uncontrollably, trying to process what had just happened. I told the stage manager what I had seen, but she only looked at me with a confused expression. "Are you okay?" she asked. "The audience was just fine. Everyone seemed to enjoy your performance." But I knew what I had seen. The audience was not human. The figure in the back, it wasn't a person either. It was something else, something that had no place in the real world. I couldn't go back to the auditorium after that night. The next day, when I tried to return to the stage to collect my things, I found that the auditorium was locked. No one had the keys, and no one had been inside since the night of the performance. When the janitor finally opened the door, everything seemed normal, except for one thing. The seats were all in disarray, some turned sideways, some facing the wrong direction. And the worst part? When I looked at the front row, I saw the same blank, lifeless faces staring back at me from the seats. The figures from the performance were still there, even though the auditorium had been empty for hours. I never returned to that auditorium again. I finished my final semester and left the college, but the memories of that night still haunt me. To this day, I wonder if I was the only one who saw those figures in the audience. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that auditorium is still there, waiting for the next performance. Story 2. It was the middle of my sophomore year, and I had just been cast in a leading role for a major theater production. The whole school was buzzing about it. The auditorium was one of the oldest buildings on campus, and while it was beautiful, with its grand stage and velvet curtains, there was something about it that felt off. The air always felt heavy when you stepped inside, as if the room had absorbed the tension of every performance ever held there. The rehearsal process was intense. We practiced late into the night, perfecting our lines and blocking. I remember one particular night when I was the last one left in the auditorium. Everyone else had gone home, and I had stayed behind to work on my monologue. The rest of the stage crew had left hours ago, and I was alone in the darkened theater. As I walked around the stage, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The auditorium was eerily silent, except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards beneath my feet. But the silence felt different this time. It was suffocating. I took my position on stage, speaking my lines aloud, trying to focus. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper coming from the audience. I froze. The auditorium was empty, at least I thought it was. I looked into the darkness of the seating area, but all I could see were rows and rows of empty chairs. I told myself it was just the wind, or perhaps my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again. A soft whisper, barely audible, but undeniably real. It seemed to come from the first few rows. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer, just the whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone of it was unmistakably sinister. I backed away from the stage, my eyes scanning the seats, but everything remained still. The whispering grew louder, and now it seemed to be coming from different parts of the auditorium. It felt like there were dozens of voices, all speaking in hushed tones. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath forming in the dim light. That's when I saw it. In the front row, one of the seats began to move. Slowly, it tilted forward, as if someone was leaning toward the stage. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I could feel the pressure building, as if the very room was closing in on me. Then, I heard a voice. Clear as day. "You shouldn't have stayed." I spun around, but there was no one there. Panicked, I rushed for the exit, my breath coming in short gasps. But as I reached the door, I turned one last time to look at the audience. To my horror, the seats were no longer empty. Each one was filled with shadowy figures, their faces obscured, but I could feel their eyes on me. Unblinking. Unblinking. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, echoing through the empty halls of the auditorium, and I sprinted out, slamming the door behind me. The next day, I told my friends about what happened, but they all laughed it off. "It's just an old theater," they said. "You probably just got scared by the dark." But I knew what I had heard, and I wasn't the only one. A few weeks later, I found out that the auditorium had a dark past. Years before, a student had mysteriously disappeared during a late-night rehearsal. It was rumored that he had been on stage when something, or someone, had dragged him into the darkness of the seats. His body was never found, and after that, strange things began happening in the auditorium. Some said the whispers came from the missing student's spirit, forever trapped in the seats, longing for attention. I never set foot in that auditorium again after that night. I finished the production, but I would never return to the stage where I had heard those whispers. And to this day, I wonder if the spirits of that theater still linger, waiting for someone else to listen. Story 3. It was my junior year at college, and I had just been cast in the lead role for our theater department's biggest production of the year. The entire cast was excited. This show was going to be our best performance yet. We rehearsed for months in the old college auditorium, a grand building with a long history. One of the older professors, Dr. Harris, was the director. He was an eccentric man with a deep love for the theater, but he was also known to be a bit superstitious. He would often warn us about the old spirits that roamed the building, but we thought he was just trying to keep us on our toes. After all, it was an old theater, creaky floorboards, strange echoes, cold spots. It all added to the atmosphere, right? But one night, things took a turn. We were running through a scene during a late rehearsal. It was around midnight, and the rest of the campus was quiet. Everyone was tired, but we pushed through. The stage was lit dimly, and the audience section was completely dark. As I delivered my lines from the center of the stage, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. The air in the auditorium felt thick, almost suffocating. My voice echoed strangely, as if the walls themselves were absorbing my words. But I kept going, trying to ignore the growing feeling that I was being watched. Then, out of nowhere, a single clap rang out from the empty seats. I stopped, startled, and looked toward the audience. The place was supposed to be empty. Dr. Harris was backstage with the rest of the crew, and the lights were dim, so there was no one out there. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. Silence. I shook my head, thinking it was just my imagination, but then it happened again. A slow, deliberate clap, followed by another, then another. It sounded like a single person clapping, their hands echoing in the dark theater. "Stop messing around," I called out. But there was no response. The clapping stopped for a moment, and I tried to continue with the scene. But now I felt a cold chill creeping up my spine. I could hear the faintest whispering coming from the seats, voices so soft I couldn't make out the words. And then another clap. This time it was louder. It felt almost like an applause. I couldn't take it anymore. I walked to the edge of the stage, trying to peer into the darkness of the audience. "Who's there?" I asked again, more forcefully this time. But there was no answer. I turned to leave the stage and told Dr. Harris about the strange sound when I went backstage. He listened intently, his face growing more serious by the second. "The phantom applause," he said, his voice low. "You've heard of it, haven't you?" I shook my head. Dr. Harris explained that, years ago, during a performance of a different production, a young actor had fallen to his death from the balcony. It was an accident. He had lost his footing during a scene and plunged to the ground. The audience had gasped in horror, but strangely, they had also clapped afterward, as if they thought it was part of the performance. Ever since that night, people said that the phantom applause could be heard after each rehearsal or performance in the theater. It wasn't an audience clapping. It was something else. Something that hadn't left the theater. I didn't believe him at first, but then, the next night, it happened again. As I stood in the middle of the stage, I heard the slow clapping start up once more. This time, it felt different. It was as if the hands clapping weren't human. The sound was too mechanical, too rhythmic, like the clap of someone who was trying to mimic applause, but couldn't quite get it right. I turned, and for a brief moment, I saw something in the darkness. An indistinct shape, sitting in one of the front row seats. It was too far away to make out any details, but I felt its eyes on me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I could no longer pretend it was just my imagination. The phantom applause was real, and it was waiting for us to finish our performance. The next day, I found out that I wasn't the only one who had heard it. Several members of the cast had experienced the same thing. Some of them had even seen shadows moving in the audience during late rehearsals, but they were too afraid to say anything. We were all spooked, but there was little we could do. The show must go on, as they say. The night of our final performance, the phantom applause returned. It started just after the final curtain fell, the same slow clapping, as if someone in the audience was applauding our performance. But when we looked out into the dark auditorium, we saw no one. The theater was empty, save for the ghostly sound of clapping that echoed off the walls. I've heard that the clapping still happens sometimes when the auditorium is empty. Some say it's the spirit of that lost actor forever applauding the performances that continue in the theater. But whatever it is, I've never set foot in that auditorium again.